Welcome to Chapter 9, the final chapter, Late Adulthood, as we complete our semester-long journey through the human lifespan. As we can see, now we are blatantly, officially throwing out the term old. So we have old age, late adulthood. This is close to the end, and everybody has to accept it. And in many ways, if you make it to this stage, you're already fortunate, especially historically speaking. But we also have the real fact of people living longer in many countries, much longer than used to be the case even 100 years ago. And so what does late adulthood look like normally? Is there an old age, and then for some countries, even an old age stage after being old for a decade or more? Specifically, though, we'll talk about the issue that Erickson presents of integrity versus despair. And of course, if we make it to old age, we don't want it to be full of despair, anxiety, and sadness. What we want, and what Erickson said is healthy and is the product of a life well lived, if you've successfully navigated his previous stages as guideposts, you can experience old age with integrity, which means, yes, you cannot do the things you used to do. So that time is mostly over. But there are things that you can do now, and can you look back on the legacy that you've worked so hard to create with pride? And that's the goal. So hopefully we can all achieve that through our own individual patterns in our lifespan. Now here's a word on precision. Oftentimes you'll hear the terms life expectancy and longevity and lifespan used interchangeably. What I want to make clear is that they are not all the same, and the one that is different is lifespan. So lifespan technically is the max number of years a person or any species can live. So it is the upper bound that a species can live. In humans, that tends to be 100, 125. Of course, there aren't many of those people that actually make it. And of course, we have biblical accounts of Methuselah living to be, 800, 900 years old. We don't have any actual evidence that someone has lived that long. So as far as evidence, scientific evidence, the most we have to go by is that if our goal is to live as long as humanly possible, the upper bound on humanly possible is 125. On the other hand, what is more applicable to most of us is the concept of life expectancy. On average, what is the longevity? This is synonymous. These two can be used interchangeably. What is the average number of years that a person is expected to live? Now, of course, if we just average across the world, that's not very useful because differences, drastic differences can be found between countries, which I'll show in a little bit. And the main change of the last 50 years is that worldwide longevity and life expectancy has increased for many countries. Not all, but many countries. And that results in a much greater proportion of the worldwide population to be over 65, right? And we've talked about population pyramids in the past, and specifically with the US, we have a fairly healthy population pyramid, but our baby boomer generation is now pushing into old age, retirement age. And this is going to be much more exacerbated when China's later baby boom pushes its way to retirement and old age and lives longer. And so this is something that's good and a product of nations having decades of successful economic performance, but also if you have a lot of people living to old age, that's going to be expensive, right? And so these are considerations that we have to keep in mind, the good and the bad of what it looks like to have a country shift from pre-industrialized to industrialized to then post-industrialized. You just have more older people. Also, we can compare countries and genders. So if we look at the countries with the highest life expectancy, we see many Western European countries, as well as westernized, industrialized countries, Canada, Australia, and the leader is Japan for both males and females. What's interesting is the US is falling kind of behind, right, compared to Japan. 4-year difference for males and females. And also, look at the difference between males and females on average. So we're looking at a 5 to 6 year on average difference between the life expectancy of females and males. And so across these countries, females can just expect to live longer, and on average by 5 to 6 years. If we want to see this pictorially and not just focus on Western industrialized countries, we can see clearly the US, Japan, Western Europe, and Canada and Australia have the highest life expectancies. And look specifically areas of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, which have drastically lower life expectancies. In some cases, below 50. The average citizen will not expect to make it to 50 years old. And so here we see writ large economic disparity across the globe. And so you can argue that Americans' goal should be to increase their life expectancy. And again, if we're living longer, we want to make sure it's healthy living longer. I think the quality of life in old age for the US, lots of data shows, is not great compared to specifically what it's like in Japan, right? So the goal isn't just to live longer, but also, is it part of our goal and our mission to bring up other parts of the world as well? And that tends to ebb and flow as time passes in terms of whether we are responsible for helping other parts of the world increase their life expectancy. I always enjoy this part of the class because we can talk about what we see here, survival curves. Of course, we look comparing species. We see that out of 1,000 born, what percent lived to reach their maximum lifespan? And of course, very few humans actually make it to live to be 120 years old, but 75% of them, or most of them, excuse me, will live to be 75% of the max lifespan, right? So what's that? 75% of 120, we're looking at about 75 to 80 in general. So what this means is that of 1,000 humans born, most of them are going to reach adulthood, and most of them are going to reach old adulthood, right? Compared to other species, right? I don't know about dinosaurs. Many young are killed off, but then the ones that survive are likely to last into adulthood. Whereas, for example, many birds seem to have a more steady rate of decline. So most birds, many will die at various ages consistently. What's more important for humans is, let's look sort of longitudinally or over time, right? Here's where we are now on our survival curve, right? But we weren't always like that, right? So just move back to the 1500s, so 400, 500 years ago, we had much greater infant mortality, young children dying, right? But even those who made it to adulthood are still dying off more consistently throughout the lifespan, right? It's only in recent times do we have this very low death rate until we get to our 60s and 70s, right? So we are living, it doesn't feel like it, but we are living in a historically very unique time with high life expectancies. Another aspect of aging that I want to distinguish between is what's known as primary versus secondary age. Primary aging is what's going to naturally happen. And of course, the absolute concept of lifespan, our primary aging says that we can't live past 100, 125 years, right? We're going to physically, cognitively deteriorate such that we cannot survive. However, primary aging we know is going to happen this we don't have much control over, right? As we age and move through adulthood, our muscle mass is going to decrease. Our bone density is going to decrease. Our visual and auditory capacities are going to go down, right? But the rate of loss, or how fast they decline, can be a product of secondary aging. And these are the social behavioral factors, things we have control over that can slow the rate of loss. And so again, turning back to the health savings account, the things we do in early and middle adulthood that maybe don't seem like they're benefiting us that much, by the time we get to old adulthood, then we can really appreciate the benefits of the sacrifices or the commitments to healthy living that hopefully we've all made. Also want to focus on the difference between old age terms that are related but not identical. We have gerontology, which is the larger study of the biopsychosocial, all these aspects of aging. So not just the biology, but the psychological aspects. How do we feel? How do we think? And social, right? Emotionally, how do we interact with our surroundings? On the other hand, geriatrics is a subtype of gerontology that focuses specifically on the physical and the medical aspects of aging, right? So if you're involved with nursing, for example, you might be more heavily involved with the geriatric component. If you're involved with social work, on the other hand, or working in a nursing home program development, you're more on the gerontology, psychosocial aspect of the spectrum. I think now is an appropriate time to discuss why we age. And we still have an unclear understanding of why humans age. And just like in many aspects of psychology, there's no one theory, there's no one law, like the law of gravity, on the other hand, to explain it all. And so multiple theories can be correct at the same time. And so there are lots of different ones that we could throw out. I just wanted to narrow it down to a couple. So first of all, we have this genetic programming theory. The idea here is that, well, there's programming in our genes related to the concept of epigenesis that we covered earlier, that genes are just going to turn on and turn off and express themselves at different points in our life. And there's some things that we can do to control it, but we don't really know that much about epigenesis. And there's other research to show that genes have telomeres or ends, and that there's only so many of them. Once you run out of them, then they start to divide in unpredictable and mutated ways. So things start to go haywire, and that's all programmed in. You can't add more of these sequences of the genes. So there is a lot of research to support there is a genetic component to aging. Also, we have, though, the more psychosocial aspect, the variable rate. Here are the choices that we make, our lifestyle. Sometimes we refer to this as wear and tear. And so we asked the previous question of why do females live longer than males? The most common explanation is wear and tear. Males are more likely to do physical labor and are just going to break down earlier. There might be something to that. Historically, I don't know if I buy that as a full explanation of currently. Why do males live 5 to 6 years fewer than females? We also have the idea of free radicals, right? Exposure to toxins, and the more free radicals that we have in our body that we expose ourselves to and are bouncing around and potentially damaging our organs and our genes, the faster we age. And so we have the idea of superfruits and superfoods that can potentially limit our exposure and remove the free radicals from our system. I think there's a lot of pseudoscience involving free radicals. I think there's initially some good science and then a lot of pseudoscience or marketing built up outside of that. But you have the classic superfoods of especially blueberries and blackberries on the fruit side and kale and spinach on the vegetable side that are thought to include the most antioxidants that fight free radicals and thereby extension fight aging. Now, I don't think it's completely snake oil or complete placebo or fake treatment. But I think if you're just watching an infomercial about how antioxidants work, I would be a little skeptical. I want to hear it from a doctor. I want to know it's based on strong, independent, experimental research. So once again, the theory is still being explored as to exactly why antioxidants are good and how antioxidants fight the free radicals that may be in our bodies. So again, I'm not saying it's bunk. I'm saying we still need to understand more about how the process works. Let's look a little bit at the brain. And yes, it does shrink. So if we make it to 90 years old, it will have shrunken by 10% in terms of our cortical size. But that is not uniform or equal throughout all the cortex. And so we see what's hurt the most: prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex, very important for focusing attention. Attention, important for fluid intelligence. So not surprisingly, if our prefrontal cortex is shrinking at 10% or more, we are going to see a corresponding loss or decline of the fluid intelligence that we see. And when the cortical volume shrinks, so you're losing mass or tissue, that typically is replaced by cerebrospinal fluid. Now, also, some parts, very limited, can grow. So dendrites can expand or increase in very limited examples, right? So there is what's called neurogenesis, or the genesis or creation of neurons. Also synaptogenesis, the creation of synapses or connections between neurons. But it is very limited. So some documented cases of the hippocampus, if somebody is living in a very information-rich environment, their hippocampus can grow new neurons. One other example is, for some reason, if a female is around a newborn baby, it doesn't have to be even the birth mother. There's something about that experience that can cause some limited neurogenesis. But the key is, this is very limited. There are very few examples, but it is possible, leading for potential future research on how to grow the brain potentially in the future. Also, what we see is a decreased lateralization, right? As we talked about, as the brain is organizing itself in childhood, we see increased lateralization. And now, once we get to the end of life, we see a decrease. So, for example, the right hemisphere controlling the left hand, well, that becomes a little more diffuse or a little less specific as we age. So it's interesting that we have the specific pattern of how the brain develops and builds up through birth, babyhood, childhood. And in many ways, we can reverse that pattern for how the brain breaks itself down in old age. Now let's talk about old age with regard to caregiving and living situations. And one concept that is really important and often brought up with regard to these contexts is activities of daily living and instrumental ADLs, or activities of daily living. And basically, the ADLs are the essentials that you should be doing every day and need to be able to do on your own to live alone completely or to live independently. On the other hand, there are some secondary or instrumental things that you should need to be able to do, not necessarily every day, but be able to do when needed. And so to the extent that you can't do these, the instrumental activities of daily living, you might need some help from friends or family or neighbor, or limited services such as food drop-off. If you can't do the ADLs, you might need, for example, to have family members divide up shifts to help you and be around for long periods of time. Home health might be something that's needed. Or, for example, if you can't do many ADLs, you may need to be in some sort of managed care or nursing home facility. So I'm thinking of this from a social work perspective, where somebody might be doing an assessment, somebody from Job and Family Services, to determine, based on IADLs or ADLs, if somebody is capable of living at home, and if they are, what kind of assistance from the community or from the family that they might need. And of course, these are both limited from chronic conditions ranging from asthma to cancer to diabetes to cardiovascular conditions or to combinations. And the more of these chronic conditions and the longer we've been living with them, the more difficult they can be to manage and the more help that we might need. Related to this is the idea of reserve capacity. This is sort of your max organ functioning. And this is if we, for example, are attacked or robbed and need to fight back or run away, right? How fast can we do it? How efficiently will our organs maximize their ability to generate a response? Now, as we get to older age, we have a reduction in reserve capacity, but oftentimes we're not aware because we don't test the system as much as we should. So the idea here is if we're eating healthy and exercising regularly, that's a way to keep our reserve capacity from declining much, right? If you're a runner, you might have heard the term VO max. This is your max respiratory or breathing efficiency. And sometimes through training, you want to go through to your absolute max for some reps just to build up your reserve capacity. So for example, if somebody's older and they used to run but haven't run in 20 years and ask them to run a mile if they have to, they might think they could do it because they used to. I think what they'd find out is that their reserve capacity has declined so much that after maybe a quarter mile, their breathing rate would be so heavy that they have to stop because they can't get enough oxygen in. And then their heart rate might be so high that they have to stop because it feels like their heart's going to jump out of their chest. Again, reserve capacity will go down, but through regular cardiovascular activity, we can keep it as robust so that if we're attacked or if we need to mobilize our resources, we can with a high reserve capacity. I want to introduce one study today called the NUN study. This is unique. Hopefully I'll be able to show some links up with this slideshow. It's famous because it uses a unique sample of nuns in Minnesota, and it was funded by the National Institute on Aging. And what they found is that the experience of a nun is different from many people in the US who are going through old age. And those differences are that nuns, by their job, are committed to a lifestyle that emphasizes a lot of things that we think are healthy for adults to do. So they are working with kids. They have a lot of jobs involving food preparation and gardening and building maintenance. They're also responsible for self-care, such as praying, serving others. And we find out that a lot of those things don't make you a lot of money in US society, but man, they sure are a good investment for successful and positive aging once you get to old age. So I think the results of the nun study show that if we look to do a lot of the things that nuns do, sort of by their job and by their spiritual commitment, if we can incorporate those things into our own lives when we're in old age, we're going to see a lot of benefits, such as more positive emotions, more mental activity, teaching others, working with kids, and mentoring. And then that predicts or leads to longevity or greater life expectancy, living longer. Also wanted to introduce a finding that comes up a ton in old age research. And this is the idea of caloric restriction. And what we found is that tons and tons of laboratory research, specifically with animals, finds that if you reduce the calories that they consume, we find out that they are healthier and they live longer, right? And so this is, maybe I'll put a link up to what's called the Caloric Restriction Society. And you might think, well, this is a fine line between restricting calories for healthy needs compared to, is this leading to potential anorexia and eating disorder? And the key is, we don't know, right? There's boundaries of how much you should restrict your average diet depending on how bad or calorie-rich your diet happens to be. The problem is that this is consistently shown in lab animals, but lab animals are often selected because you want to get them fattened up as fast as possible so you can start doing your research on them. And so if you just take them off that rich diet, of course they start to look a little bit healthier. So the question would be, are you interested in caloric restriction? I think we should be, if it leads to eating healthier, and if we're eating too many calories, to adjust that to a healthy number of calories. The problem is we don't have a ton of human research showing that it works in humans. So I think there's probably something here biologically, but I don't think that means we should all slash our calories and go toward anorexic territory, right? I'm not suggesting that by any means. So here's an example. We have the monkey on the left, the monkey on the right. The monkey on the left, what's interesting is on the caloric restriction. And so the monkey on the left looks less healthy, but in fact, by a lot of measures, is actually healthier. So one thing, if this generalizes to humans, if we're doing caloric restriction, we would not do it necessarily to look better or more attractive. And of course, you can see here the equivalent, human equivalence of a healthy diet and the corresponding calories versus an unhealthy diet and the much larger corresponding calories. And of course, I don't know if this monkey looks any healthier appearance-wise, but if we measured a lot of their vital physical symptom or conditions, we would find that this monkey tests to represent greater health than this monkey who's been eating the richer calorie diet. So once again, and again, the Olsen twins, not actually twins, do we want people to look like that? No, we wouldn't do caloric restriction for appearances. But I think if we were going to do something with our diet, look at how many calories we're consuming. And most Americans don't count calories, so me included. I don't know how many calories I eat a day, and that's probably shame on me. So given that, if I'm eating too many calories, caloric restriction would probably help me to structure my diet. But I did want to point out that a lot of things such as anti-aging, what does that mean? We can't turn back aging. Aging doesn't have a legal definition. So literally any product could say it's anti-aging, proven to fight aging, and have no research or legal basis for saying that. So when things say they're anti-aging, I'm skeptical. Unless it's supported by strong experimental research, it's probably a placebo. Let's look at what happens in terms of cognition as we age. These are probably pretty obvious, and we would expect these, and we've observed these in older people that we know. With regard to attention, we know attention is important for fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence has been declining fairly consistently for decades leading up to old age. So of course the attention is also lower. This is due to our shrinking working memory. Working memory, again, is a huge component of fluid intelligence. And so even if, for example, in middle adulthood, we're working, we're interactive, we're leading rich work lives and social lives, trying to reduce the decline of fluid intelligence as much as we can. Let's say we flatten that curve as much as we can for reducing fluid intelligence. Once we get to old age, even though we've been reaping the benefits of our smart decisions, that curve is going to start to go down more sharply once we start to age in old age. Also, we look at memory, what's happening with regard to explicit. Performance gets slower, but again, the accuracy is okay. So again, as long as there's not a condition that is eating away at the brain or injuring the brain, the explicit memories are still there, but the process of getting them out, the retrieval cues that we need are more. Implicit, so sort of automatic memory of how to walk, how to talk, how to make, for example, recipes that you've made all your life, that's still there too. Those routines are there, but it also slows down. So the performance is possible, but it takes more time. And maybe people need more help to do the things that they used to do very quickly and automatically. Now let's turn our attention to old age and things that we might experience in terms of psychological disorder, or disability. And the first one that we are all probably familiar with is dementia. What's important to note is that dementia is very broad, and it generally involves a loss or an impairment of mental activity. It can include memory loss, loss of executive function, as we talked about in earlier slideshows, even a loss of sense of self or identity. So one thing is, it's important to, if you're having a grandparent or parent who's slowing down, showing a noticeable impairment of memory, maybe get a diagnosis of dementia from a mental health professional or a doctor. But then the next step is to realize there are lots of potential causes of dementia. Some are chronic, some, on the other hand, can be reversed. And so then you want to know what is causing the dementia that we see, right? And again, dementia is just what we observe about cognitive or mental functioning, but not what's causing that. One common cause is Alzheimer's. Sometimes I've heard people refer to it as old timers, but no, it's Alzheimer's, named after the physician who discovered it. Alzheimer's is, we think, a potential epidemic here in the US because as we age, we are all at increased risk for developing Alzheimer's. What's encouraging, though, is we have seen evidence of other cultures where there's high life expectancies, such as Italy and Japan, where there are lower rates of Alzheimer's. So that's the optimistic view, is that even though as Americans we're at greater risk, there are things that we probably can do or not do to reduce our risk. On the other hand, we know that things that are characteristic of the US population, not exercising enough, having cardiovascular troubles, those are risk and protective factors. And so the less of these things we do can increase our risk for Alzheimer's disease. Although I don't want to pretend that these are the only risk factors. There's lots of others, including dietary exposure to potential chemicals. I mean, there's lots of potential theories out there and small risk factors for Alzheimer's. I'm just focusing on one of the obvious things that we can do. Also, Alzheimer's, important to note that we diagnose it as we suspect it in living patients, but the definitive diagnosis traditionally involves postmortem or after death, looking in the cortical tissue and seeing if there are the characteristic plaques and tangles that should not be there in a healthy brain. Also, we look at another cause of dementia, Parkinson's disease, and this is characterized by difficulty with moving and tremors, and this could be another cause of dementia. Parkinson's has seen a lot of promising treatments involving the dopamine system, and so I think Parkinson's is treatable and manageable in a way that, as far as we know, Alzheimer's is not, at least to our current understanding. This is the DSM. There's currently a DSM-5, but I'm going with the previous version for dementia, which hasn't changed a lot. You don't have to know all these for the exam by any means, but just to give you an idea. So there's potentially an aphasia, which is difficulty with language. There's apraxia, which can be difficulty of carrying out intentional or purposeful movements, although there's no obvious physical impairment otherwise. And then we can have agnosias, which are difficulty recognizing people specifically or other kinds of objects that we need to know in our lives. And interestingly, marked or noticeable decreased need for sleep, right? And also, we need to put these in context that they are interfering with our cognitive or occupational and social functioning, and that it's not just slowing down, but it is a notable decline or a notable change. And also, one thing to point out is that dementia is different from delirium. Delirium is a state that sort of comes and goes and is more intense, whereas dementia, it seems to have an onset and then sort of stay there. So if we look at the diagnostic tree for dementia, we can see what is obvious to the other people around is that there's a memory impairment. Then you want to, first of all, eliminate any other possible causes, right? So even some forms of depression can cause dementia-like memory impairment. Once you rule that out, rule out the impact of drugs and other medications, then we make the diagnosis of dementia, but look at all the possible different kinds, right? Alzheimer's dementia, vascular dementia, Lewy body dementia, and various combinations of those kinds. So as you can see, dementia is a general thing that many of us, if we make it to old age, will be diagnosed with, but the exact causes of that can be drastically different. And once again, it's kind of funny to laugh at forgetful seniors. Just because grandpa or grandma or mom or dad are becoming forgetful, it does not mean they have dementia, right? It's a noticeable change from where they were, 3 months ago, 6 months ago. And if you can notice it, chances are something serious is happening in the brain for some reason or other. Let's talk about Erikson's psychosocial stage. As we mentioned at the start of the slideshow, integrity is the key word here. And where we talked about having a midlife review for middle adulthood, midlife review is suggesting that it's a time to evaluate and potentially change your course if you were veering off from generativity. Now, once we get to old age, we're sort of toward the end, right? Not the absolute end, it's not done, but you're looking back more than looking forward, right? And so are you looking back on your life like Scrooge did in A Christmas Tale with despair, right? Or are you looking back at your life with integrity? And I thought about changing the Joe Paterno example because, he was at Penn State for 30 plus years, and there were child sexual abuse, sexual assault that was under his management. We still don't know how much he knew, but just bear with me here. Joe Paterno and his wife and his family devoted their career and life to the university. They donated lots of money for libraries, fundraising, and causes. And you just wonder, somebody like Joe Paterno, he died in the middle of the media storm involving the child sexual abuse cases. What would he have been thinking about his lasting legacy? I think it was a very mixed legacy, but he also did have reasons to end his life with some form of integrity, right? And that goes to show that Erikson's integrity versus despair is less about other people's judgments of you and more about what you've done, your identity, your goals. Did you achieve those or not, right? Are you okay with your lasting legacy, or did you blow it, right? And I think the overriding goal for us is to leave old age, if we make it there, with the idea that we didn't waste our time and that we didn't blow it, right? And if we had chances for generativity, to raise a family, to make a difference in people's life in early and middle adulthood, and we did not make those choices, I think Erikson would say that we would view those times with regret. As we start to wrap things up, I wanted to talk about maybe the dominant model of successful aging that we have in lifespan. And we have here Paul Baltus. You don't necessarily have to know him for the exam, but just know that in the field of lifespan development, he was one of the very, very most influential academics that we had. Just a leading visionary in how do we think about and organize and move forward to understand aging, and how do we make it better. And he came up with his selective optimization with compensation theory. And this is a model that he used integrating a lot of research, tons of theory that had previously been done on aging. And he was looking for high-level patterns, high-level connections. And here's what he came up with. This is a model for successful aging that I think, if we use this, can provide a roadmap for us as we navigate through adulthood moving forward. So first of all, we need to select things that we are going to get better at and that we can improve, right? So if we're looking in terms of athletes, right? Can an athlete say, I want to improve my vertical leap and I want to improve my 40-yard dash time as I move from my 20s to my 30s. No, the biology is going to say that no, you can't get faster, you can't jump higher. You had your peak in your 20s, you're going to go down, you have to deal with it. What things can you do though? Can you be a better teammate? Yes. Can you learn more about the game? Yes. Can you put in time outside of practice, looking at film, studying other organizations that you didn't take time to do before? Yes. So all those things, you select things that you can do as we're doing aging, things that don't involve a heavy draw on fluid intelligence, but instead do involve a heavy draw on crystallized intelligence, which we can maintain or even increase as we age. Second of all, how do we, once we've selected the things we're going to try and keep or improve on, how do we make that happen? What strategies are we using to achieve those things that we've selected to improve? And then finally, compensation, right? This is where we have to face up with the real world that there are some things as we age that we can't do with the success that we used to, right? So we have to swallow our pride, we have to seek help and get assistance from other people. So I think about especially NBA athletes. What happens to NBA players as they age? Well, as their pattern recognition and understanding of the game improves, especially offense, they tend to get better or keep their offensive production. Problem is, they don't have enough reserve capacity to go 100% the whole game. So like LeBron has to manage his minutes, play fewer minutes, first of all, so we're compensating there. You can't play as many minutes as you used to. And second of all, those times you're out in the court, you can't go 100%, right? So LeBron, Kobe Bryant, basically as they aged, they just kind of played less defense, right? Offensive, their numbers look good, and their production is good. But as far as playing defense, they need to rely on their teammates much more to provide them the help or to cover them in a way that they didn't have to when they were younger. So here is Paul Baltus himself. Here are some classic examples of the selective optimization compensation model. So first of all, selection. You have to actually take some time to write out and think about some things in terms of your career, your family, and social commitments, what you can get better at, what you can succeed at, and maybe cut out the stuff that you're going to get worse at, right? Let somebody else do those things. Second of all is the optimization. These are the things that nobody else sees. Think of somebody you know who's old and just killing it, right? It's not that they're just born lucky, right? They are actually putting in, and this is what Baltus researchers find, they have put in tons of time practicing and finding others that they want to model their specific behaviors. Find someone you want to model and ask them, what are they doing? How do they make it look so easy? How are you able to do this at the age that you're doing it? And you won't find, well, I guess I'm just lucky. Baltus found instead that there was a very intentional and dedicated practice, persistent, and modeling process. And then, of course, the compensation, right? You're going to have to, you can't do it all as you age. And so you need to strategically and intentionally get rid of those things that you can't do anymore, right? And if you've used this model in terms of your career, you'll have been climbing the ladder toward a job that emphasizes the things that you've been practicing. And then instead of working in that same job and then finding out that you can't do some of those aspects of the job and then having to be moved yourself or forced to move or even fired because you haven't thought about long term where you want to be and if that fits with the skills that you're likely to have. And then finally, as we talk about old age, I wanted to talk a little bit about discrimination. So we have what's known as the ADEA, or the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. What's interesting to me is that we have the cutoff at age 40. So we don't normally think of somebody over age 40 as an older worker. But in fact, legally, in terms of discrimination, that is the cutoff, right? And this does work both ways. So what this law says is that you are not allowed to make employment decisions based on age, right? So you can't just say, I'm hiring older people, I'm hiring younger people, right? What you can do is make employment decisions that have an impact on age, right? So oftentimes layoffs may look like more younger people or more older people are being affected. And in that case, if that happens, there is a prima facie or introductory case to be made, and so as an employer, if you're using good management and human resources techniques, you'll have a good reason to justify the employment decisions you've made. And so even if a discrimination case is brought against you, it'll probably hold up in court if you were making it for good business-related reasons. But I think a lot of corporations get themselves in economic trouble, find themselves that they have to make decisions right away, and then they cut the old people because they are costing more or more expensive. And then if you don't have any more justification than that, then yes, you're going to get your butt handed to you in court. And now I promise we've arrived at the end of this slideshow, and more importantly, the end of our journey through adult development, human development, in fact. So thank you for your time, and I hope you found a number of these things that we've covered that will be useful to you in your career, in your life, with your family, with your community moving forward. Best wishes, and thank you again.